Wonderful. So hello, everybody. We are getting ready to start our live event. We are so happy you are all joining us. As folks hop on, if you could just
Wonderful. So hello, everybody. We are
if you don't mind dropping in where you are tuning in from, let us know in the chat how many people there are. Are you a classroom? Is it a family? We'd love to hear where you are coming from and who you're with. We have a great session for everybody today. I am so excited to have with us Sarah Gotzi and her team live from Tulick Field Station. Oh, wonderful. Thank you all. We've got some folks of third grade and fourth grade classrooms, Virginia, Minnesota. This is cool. Every time we do this, I test my knowledge of state abbreviations, which is great. We are so excited to have you with us. We're going to give everybody another minute or two to join because we are right at 1 o'clock Eastern. Hello from Paris. And we have California. Oh, I love international. Canada. Canada knows it's cold, I'm sure. They are familiar with the weather that Sarah's experiencing right now. Also, we have some classrooms. Oh, Alabama, Roll Tide, but that's Southern Alabama, sorry. And we are going to get started. Please, as I said, if you're just joining us, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop a line in the chat, how many people there are. We are so excited to have you with us. To start, I'm just going to go over some ground rules and we'll be underway. So welcome. As you might have noticed, our attendees are muted and cannot turn on their video. Part of that is to make sure that our folks in the field have enough bandwidth to even come to you. One of the things I do want to let you know, Sarah and her team, they are in really northern part of Alaska. We'll show you a map in a little bit, but that does mean that internet can be a little spotty. So I just ask that you bear with us. If there's a freeze in the connection, they will get back with us. We have our chat open right now. We're going to close that in a little bit, but you do have the Q&A function. So please use the Q&A to submit all of your questions for Sarah and her team. We are so excited to get as many as we can. We might not be able to answer all of them, but we will try. Again, this is being recorded. It's also being live streamed to YouTube. So after the event, I will be sending an email to everyone who's registered today, and you will be able to rewatch this and rewatch this and rewatch this as much as you would like online. So as I mentioned, Sarah and her team are coming you live from Tulick Field Station, which is northern Alaska. Here's a little map. On the left side there of where Tulick is, it is north of the Arctic Circle, which is that blue dotted line that you might be able to see. And Haley's going to talk a little bit more about Tulick when we get there. And then on the right, this is what the station looks like. This is what I assume a nice summer day there because there's not much snow on the ground in that photo. So just a little bit about Tulick Station. It is operated and managed by the Institute of Arctic Biology and the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and is supported by the National Science Foundation. So I should have said, I'm Sarah Ecker. I work for the National Science Foundation. I forgot that. I was so excited. And for reference, Tulick is 370 miles north of Fairbanks, and even further north from Anchorage. So we are up there in the cold. So I'm going to turn it over to Haley in a minute, but Haley is an ecologist and communicator. She has her doctorate studying tundra plants, and she works at Tulick, or for Tulick, as a communications and diversity, equity, and inclusion manager. So Haley, please take it away.
Thanks, Sarah. So as Sarah said, we're coming to you today from Tulick Field Station, which is a remote research station located in Arctic Alaska. We're funded by the National Science Foundation, and our station exists to help scientists who study the Arctic. So whether they're studying tundra, lakes, streams, even space physics, we support the science that happens there. As you can imagine, conducting research in a really remote place like Arctic Alaska can be really exciting, but very challenging. There are no towns, there's only one dirt road, there's limited access to electricity. And so even doing the simplest things like getting water or having a dry place to sleep, planning what you're gonna eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, let alone then cooking it, can be a challenge. And so Toolik Field Station supports science and education of all types by doing these things. We also conduct science ourselves. We've been taking baseline environmental measurements for decades at this point. We keep long-term records of things like temperature, snowfall, rainfall, plants and animals. And we're coming up on our 50th year as a station, which is sort of incredible to think about. Over these decades, it's been really exciting to see how much Toolik has grown. We now host about 400 to 500 scientists every year, and our summer population can get up to 150 people. You know, as I said, the summer population can get up to 150 people. Our winter is very different. Our station operations are really entwined with the seasons. Since we're above the Arctic Circle, that means that the sun does some funky stuff. In the summer, the sun won't set for 2 months. It can be really glorious to have that amount of sun in the summertime, hence why our population is so bustling then. But in the wintertime, the sun doesn't rise for 2 months. It sets in December and then it won't rise again until late January. And so at that point, our population drops to just about 4 people. While I'm talking about where we are, it's important that I recognize that the lands that Toolik resides on are the ancestral hunting grounds of the Nunavut, Inupiat, Gwich'in, and Koyukuk Alaska Native nations. Since time immemorial, these Indigenous communities have stewarded these lands, and they continue to do so today. At Toolik, we strive to be stewards of these lands ourselves, and we're actively working to build collaborative relationships with the communities near us. So in a few minutes, I'll drop a few links in the chat, and I encourage you all to learn more about these communities' efforts. Okay, with that, today we'll be hearing from a team of 3 scientists that are currently at Toolik Field Station. This team is led by Dr. Sarah Godsey, who is a geoscience professor at Idaho State University, and she studies water and permafrost at Toolik. Dr. Godsey is joined by 2 students, Noah Campbell, who is a recently graduated undergrad from Appalachian State University at Sarah Evans Labs. And then we're also joined by Brandon Yoakley, who's a graduate student, a PhD candidate at Idaho State University in Dr. Godsey's lab. And so they've spent the past 3 summers at Toolik with their most recent project, asking how will the water cycle of the tundra change as temperatures rise and the frozen ground beneath our feet begins to thaw. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Dr. Godsey.
All right, I'm gonna start unmuting here and try to share my screen. So we'll see how well this works. Hopefully the internets will cooperate with us from all the way up here. And let's see, can you guys see my screen now? Excellent, wonderful. So I wanted to give a particular shout out to folks from Virginia. That's where I grew up. So for students who are going to school in Virginia, I know many of the places that you guys mentioned. So really exciting to see you here. And to everybody else, I hope that this is really useful as well to you. So I wanted to start out with a few questions. This first one is, what does the Arctic tundra even look like? So we've seen a couple of shots from helicopters or drones of the station, but I wanted to give you guys a sense of some of the areas in the Arctic tundra where we're doing our work. You can see a little bit behind me here. This is Toolik Lake right behind me. And while I was muted, there was a loon that was making its sounds, and it was really, really nice. That's what the Toolik, that's what the name means. So much of the year, the tundra looks a lot like this, where sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the snow on the ground and the sky above. These are a couple of researchers studying flows of water through the water track, and in this case, it's frozen. As the season progresses, and this was just this last Sunday, the snow starts to melt out, and it melts out in really patchy ways. And so that patchiness might look like some of the slopes having a little bit more snow. I don't know if you can see my mouse or not, but and then as soon as the snow is gone, then a lot of the plants start turning on, and they start doing their thing, like these little flowers that we saw blooming in some of the heath just on Sunday. And then as the season progresses, everything greens up really quickly. That hasn't happened quite yet, but it'll happen soon. And this is one of our team members enjoying a nice day as things are greening up. And then as the season continues, it gets even greener. And so by July, there's a lot of growth. Vegetation is just cranking and doing its thing. And there are also a lot of mosquitoes. So this is one of our team members, maybe not quite as happy as Key was, with a whole bunch of mosquitoes. All those little dots there on their head are mosquitoes. And so what we do for that is we wear these bug shirts. So we look a little bit like aliens, I think. And you might also notice that there's boardwalk here that this person's walking on. And we do that for two reasons. We have boardwalk out there for two reasons. One of them is that it's really hard to walk on the tundra. It's kind of like walking on a waterbed that's got balls underneath it or something like that. And then the other is to protect the tundra, because if we walk back and forth, taking all of our measurements, we can really damage the plants that only have a really short amount of time each year to grow. And so we try to minimize that by walking on our boardwalk. Then this was taken by one of our team members. This is not one of our team members. This is a muskox that is amongst the crew eating on the tundra here as the season progresses into fall. And fall here happens usually by late July or early August. And then the leaves start to turn red like they would anywhere else further south and start to drop. But that season's really short. It's really just June, July, and August where things are reliably growing and snow-free, although snow can happen at any time. I'm sure that Brandon and Noah can speak to this too, but we've certainly had snow on July 4th, and we were just shoveling a whole bunch of snow yesterday. So as snow falls, it can really cover up the landscape, and then it gets dark again and snow covered. And we leave a lot of our instruments out to take measurements, but we don't keep going with those on the ground measurements, because a lot of the ground or a lot of the water that we're studying gets frozen. So with that, maybe you want to hear more about what our team's actually studying. So we've known what the tundra looks like. Now, what is our team actually studying? You saw a figure like this before, but I really want to emphasize it because this map is different than a lot of the maps that you look at usually. So before we sort of saw the US in kind of its normal shape, where it's, we've got Canada up to our north. And instead, this map is looking down from the top of the globe at the North Pole. And then Toolik Field Station that we already talked about is right here. So this is Alaska for our friends in Fairbanks. You're right here. If you're on the East Coast, I think I saw that we had some folks from Virginia. You're in here from Florida. If you're in Texas, I live in Idaho, so I'm over here for our friends in Provo, just down the road. And then for those who are let's see, I think I saw some folks from the Bay Area, maybe Santa Cruz or San Jose. I think you guys are right over here. So we're way up north, and I show you this map because we're going to look at some information, some scientific information on this map, on a map just like this, that's motivating a lot of the work that we're doing up here. And so this is the same map where this is the North Pole in the middle. So I'm going to start on the left-hand side. And then we've got the US, the continental US where you guys are a little bit further south. And one of the things that I want you to notice here is that the red colors and orange colors are the ones that are surrounding where we're at right here. And what those represent is that it's getting warmer even faster here than it is in other places. And then on the right, the redder colors mean the rate. So the multiplication factor of how much warmer it's getting. And so these bright red colors mean that it's getting warmer at least 2 to 4 times faster up here in the Arctic than it is anywhere else. And as a hydrologist, somebody who studies water in the Arctic, I really care about temperatures because they change whether or not the water is liquid or frozen. And so what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if I'm standing on this hill looking down at this landscape, what I see are things like the water in frozen forms, like ice on this lake right here, or snow in the mountains or in these gullies. And then I see water in liquid form, like in the thawed parts of the lakes here and in the river here. And one thing that I see that you guys might not see is that I see that there's a lot of water that's hidden underground. And that's water that's hidden in the soils and in the ground that is in this valley that we're looking down on. And that brings us to permafrost. So some of you might know what permafrost is, but if you don't, I'm going to ask you just to think about it for a second. What do you think that word might mean? The way I like to break it down is that there's the permafrost, there's the perma part of permafrost. So you might think about permanent markers. And so something that stays always in a certain way. So if you draw on your hands or on the wall or on your clothes with permanent markers, you might get in trouble for that because they'll get stained. And frost is something that, we're thinking about cold conditions. And in this case, permafrost is soil or ground that's been frozen for at least 2 years. And so one of the things that's so cool about permafrost is that it can look a lot of different ways. So here you can see a chunk of permafrost where the ground is mostly just soil. And then this section where there's a little more water. And then if you look really carefully, there's this line right here in this chunk of permafrost that's actually just plain ice. And it's this pure ice lens that's in the ground. And sometimes those ice lenses can grow really big. So here is me standing on a little chunk of permafrost near some permafrost that has thawed. And so there's the top portion of the permafrost here that thaws each year. And then there's this portion of permafrost that I'm standing on, that my foot's standing on here, that is still frozen. And what you might notice if you've got eagle eyes is that there's this chunk underneath that looks like it's missing. And that's true. This was a section where the portion underneath the frozen ground that I'm standing on had actually thawed out and moved. We're going to talk about that a little more in just a second. So some of the questions that our team is asking, and I'm not going to be able to answer all of these ones today, but I'll try to give you guys an idea of the questions that we're asking is, how is the permafrost changing? And what's causing it to thaw more quickly? And then we ask questions like, how can we best study permafrost thaw, and what clues can we look for to understand the impacts and the causes of thaw? And then this last one, I do want to spend a little time talking about why is it important to study changes in permafrost? And here's another photo of permafrost, and this is from somebody at the U.S. Geological Survey who took this great picture of permafrost where there's thawed ground on top with some plants, and then permafrost that stayed frozen for at least 2 years down below. And you can see this really big chunk of white stuff in the middle. That's actually an ice wedge. And I want you to ask yourself, what do you think would happen if that ice warmed up and melted? One of the things that I can imagine might happen if that were the case is that this soil that's sitting on top of it might collapse. And if you were standing there, you might drop down all the way to the bottom of this, or you might end up, if you had your house built there, your house might get damaged. And so it might not be quite as big as this ice wedge, but there's ice wedges all over the tundra, and that's part of what we're looking for and studying. If those ice wedges or the permafrost thaws, we can have damage to homes, to hospitals or schools. We can have damage to paths and docks like this one. If there are trees in areas where permafrost is thawing, the forest can collapse, or the trees can look like they're falling over. And then the ground collapses. So there can actually be sinkholes that form like this one here in the middle of this forested area. Or they can form on roads, and sometimes they can be really big. So you can imagine if you drove a car into this, that wouldn't be a great idea. And it can damage roads without causing big sinkholes. And so we have to drive a long way to get up to Toolik, and the road up here is really, really bumpy. And part of that is due to permafrost and frost heaves and thaw. You can also, in some areas, have erosion where a whole chunk of the land will actually collapse off into the ocean in this case, or into lakes. And there are a couple of things that we also are really interested in for permafrost thaw. One that's harder to take a picture of is that some permafrost actually has microbes or things that could make us sick that are frozen in the permafrost. And if those thaw and are released, that could be a pretty big deal. And in addition, the Alaska Native communities that we heard Haley talk about earlier rely on permafrost for hunting, for traveling between villages, because it's a lot easier to travel when the ground is frozen. They also can use this permafrost to keep food cold, like as underground freezers, and for reliable water supplies. So for all of those reasons, we really care about permafrost thaw. And this is one of my favorite images. I didn't draw this, but I love these little minions that are representing the microbes in permafrost. And I just want to talk about this for a second, because the science of this is really important and really interesting to me. So intact permafrost, our little microbes are kind of holding on, and they aren't really moving around too much. But if they start to thaw, then there's a couple of options for what can happen. One is that they're in saturated ground where there's plenty of water, and they like to chew on old plants and material in the soil, things that have died and dropped their leaves or other organic material in the soil, and they like to chew on it. And if the ground is wet compared to dry, then it makes a difference what happens as they chew on that stuff. You can see in this picture that there's all these little swirls of gases that are coming off these minions that are hanging out in these microbes that are hanging out in the dry thawed permafrost. And that's because greenhouse gas releases from permafrost can be as much as 3 times higher when the soils are dry. And so we are really looking in particular at where permafrost soils are wet and dry. And so to do that, we go out into the field. So this is one of our field sites that doesn't have any internet access, so I can't take you guys there. But we set up a whole bunch of different pieces of equipment that we'll hear about in a second. And I'm just going to give you a quick overview before we turn it over to Brandon and Noah, who are going to show you some of our equipment in our lab. So how do we study where permafrost soils are wet and dry? Well, there's a bunch of different things that we're studying. One is that we've got wells installed into the permafrost where we can measure water levels and information about the soils. We also probe the soils to see how thawed they are. And we take measurements of rainfall and also the temperature of rain and the ground and the air. We use this tool called ground penetrating radar to bounce waves off of thawed and wet surfaces in the ground. And so we've got Rachel's coming up later today and will be helping us to keep going with these studies later today. We also are looking at plants and how they green up and what their temperatures are in their canopies. And then we use structures like this white area right over here that's called a weir. And those are like little dams that we use to measure the flow of water that's going through areas on the hill slope. And then for those who like to fly drones, we actually also get to use drones and satellites for science up here. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up my section, and we'll take the boardwalk here back from the tundra back towards Tulik, and we'll get a tour of the lab. Thanks, guys.
Oh, here, let's start here. Let me know when you're ready. We're going to start with this camera. Oh, cool. Sorry, we're a little disorganized. Hello, my name is Brandon. I'm Brandon Yoakley, and
I'm Noah Caldwell.
yeah, we're just going to show you a quick lab tour. I will show you around our lab, like kind of where we store everything, what kind of stuff we have in our lab, and then I have a couple of pieces of instrumentation I can show off once we've finished kind of showing you around our little lab space here. And then we'll kind of end this section with Noah's going to talk all about something called an auto sampler, which are these little R2D2 looking things. But to start with, Noah, do you want to? I'm going to switch this off.
All right, Noah, you are muted, so let me unmute you. There you go.
Awesome, cool. Now you can hear me. So welcome to our lab. We usually come in, we have two doors here. We have one that kind of goes out to, you can actively see they're moving one of the buildings on camp today, but it's pretty foggy and cold today, as you saw in Sarah's background. So we can enter from here, and then we have a great view. I guess I should show off the nice view. Our lab has one of the nicest views in camp. It's very foggy right now, so it's hard to see. But on non-foggy days, you can see the Brooks Range, you can see the Tulik Hill, and we have a nice view of the lake. But yeah, this is just kind of our little lab space. So on this side of our lab, we store all of our kind of daily use field gear. So we have a bunch of like packs of tools, way too many Ziploc bags. We have a bunch of backpacks that all of our field techs and undergrads and myself and PIs use. We have a bunch of shoes. We have two huge coolers that we store a bunch of water samples in at the end of the season. So we collect water samples using the auto samplers that Noah will talk to you about here shortly. And then we ship those back to Idaho, and then I'll filter them and process them for some work that I do. And then on this side, Noah, if you want to zoom out instead of kind of zooming in, we have a bunch of different bins full of sensors. So in this bin here, we have a bunch of soil temperature sensors. In this bin, we have something that we call stick sensors, which measure the presence or absence of water. Here, we just have a bunch of measuring devices. So things like rulers, tapes, meter tapes, and all kinds of other things. And then we have our pressure transducers in here. So, and then a ton of salt. We use a lot of salt in our work to measure how much water is flowing through the stream. So we can put salt in a stream, and then we can use this little black sensor here, which we call an EC or electroconductivity sensor. And we put this in the stream downstream where the salt is, and this measures the conductivity of the water. And we can use that to quantify how much water is flowing in the stream. And then we also have these things we call pressure transducers. So we take a well here, we pretend we have a well, and we would put a bolt through, and then we would take this pressure transducer. So this just measures like air pressure and water pressure when there's water in the well, and we would stick it in the well at a known height, and it would measure the pressure of both the water and the air what we do is 15 minutes. And then we can then use that and then subtract the air pressure from another sensor that we have just sitting in a tube, and we can get how much water is in the ground, or what we would call the water level in the ground. And then also, like I mentioned, we have something we call these little stick sensors, which are these little guys, and they look like this. They have two little electrodes at they measure relative, so they also measure how conductive the water is in the stream. And then we can convert that. If the number is usually higher than 0, we would know that there's water present where this is installed. And if it's 0, there's no water. So we use these little sensors just to measure where surface water is in our streams. And then lastly, as Sarah alluded to, we measure soil moisture. So we have these sensors that we measure soil moisture with. So that has 4 little prongs on this, and then you can go and you can stick it in the tundra and you can read how wet the soil is. So usually it's between 0 and 1, 1 being fully saturated and 0 being non-saturated. So this is how we take manual measurements. And then lastly, we have continuous soil moisture sensors that we use. So we install these in the ground with loggers that are all installed in the field, so I don't have any here. But we dig a pit and we insert these into the wall of the pit, and then these also measure soil moisture every 15 minutes. So we have a bunch of different instrumentation that we use here in the lab. And yeah, everything's just kind of here. So, and then now I am going to turn it over, and Noah's going to get behind the camera, and he's going to tell you all about auto samplers.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Noah again, and I am working as the field technician for this project. And so it's my job to help out with this project and be able to operate and install equipment that we use to collect data for this project. And so what I'm going to show you guys today is called an auto sampler. And Brandon, if you want to sort of show them a little bit closer what this looks like, the auto sampler automatically collects water samples from the streams that we are studying in the Arctic. And we will use this to look at isotopes in the water to figure out how old the water is. And this is useful because we'll be able to know if the water flowing through our streams is relatively new. Is it from snow that has melted this year? Or is this water that maybe was from snowmelt from last year? And so these are incredibly useful devices that we're able to use. And Brandon is especially using these for his research back at Idaho. So this is super interesting stuff. And I'm going to take this apart and show you guys a little bit more of what it looks like. And so they do have a lid that goes on top. And so there are sort of 2 different chambers to this. So you take off this top lid, and this is where like the brains of the operation are located. So this is basically like a supercomputer right here that you can program these auto samplers to be able to take water measurements at a specific time. So you tell this thing what time it is, and we set up these devices to take 1 measurement every day, I believe at about 10 p.m. or something like that. And so this is where you basically tell it what to do. And then once you take off the bottom chamber, which is located here, what you see is all of these bottles. And so there's 24 bottles in here, and we program these to take 1 measurement every single day. And I can take out one of these just to show you what it looks like.
You'll need to.
Yeah. There we go. Oh, and they might not come out. Yeah, there we go. And so you can see they're just basically regular water bottles. And so these are what we're going to use to collect these water samples, as well as a syringe.
Yep.
And so that's basically how these things work. One thing I can't show you, though, is how heavy they actually are. So the auto sampler, I would guess, weighs, I don't know, what would you say, Brandon, 30, 40 pounds?
35 to 40, yeah.
Really heavy. And like Sarah was talking about earlier, walking on tundra is incredibly difficult. And as you can imagine, if you're trying to walk across the tundra carrying this, it's going to be a pretty rough day. And so to help us out, we actually have a helicopter that is going to be taking these to our field sites later today. And I'm super excited because I get to fly in the helicopter and sort of jump out holding these, drop it at our field site, and then be able to install it from there. So it's going to be super exciting. And yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed checking out the auto samplers.
Cool. And with that, I am going to switch back over to, if I can figure out how to work Zoom. Switch back over. Oh, gosh. Okay, cool. So you guys, I think that's it we have for our kind of lab tour. And we are happy now to answer any questions you may have of the instrumentation we use, the science questions we're trying to answer up here, what life is like at Tulik, or anything else.
Awesome. Thank you, Brandon and Noah and
Oh,
Sarah.
you're muted, Sarah.
Oh, other Sarah. So thank you all so much. I think my favorite part was that your auto sampler's name is Bert. And I hope he has like an Ernie also, maybe you have more than one or something. So that was hands down one of my favorites. So I just want to remind everybody to please use the Q&A function that we have in Zoom to submit any of your questions. I see some coming in, and I really want to start out with maybe an overview question here. So you're studying permafrost, you're in Toolik Station. How deep is the permafrost at Toolik or at your site, would you say?
The permafrost depth here at around the Toolik area is 250 to 300 meters deep. So, and yeah, and that extends to the coastline. So as you get closer to the Arctic Ocean or the Arctic coastline, it increases to, I remember correctly, roughly 600 meters at the coastline. So, and then, but the only right around Toolik, it's only about 40 to 50 centimeters, so half a meter of thaw during the summer. And that varies obviously whether you're in a water track or in a gully, but on the hill slopes, it's about 40 to 45 centimeters of thaw. And then it's frozen for another 250 to 300 meters below that.
Wow. Okay. So 250 meters, and it's what, 3 feet per meter? Using my calculator here, about 750 feet.
Yeah. So yeah, closer to probably like 800 to 850 because it's three and a quarter per meter. Yep. Okay.
That's pretty deep. That's really impressive. And so Sarah, you showed these amazing photos of the ice in the permafrost and in the ground. And someone has asked about how that big ice wedge gets there. Is it using air pockets in the soil? Is it displacing soil? How do those form in the ground?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and something that we're trying to pay a little more attention to. But the leading explanation that's out there for how these forms is that it takes a long time, a lot of time. And so that you have an area where there's a little bit of ice that's formed. Maybe there's more water that accumulated there in a low spot. And then as things freeze up, it opens as things freeze up, it opens just a little bit. So there's a little more space for more water to come in. And then it adds a little more water that freezes, gets a little wider. And then over time, it gets wider and wider. So there's a lot of space for the water to come into, and you can form this ice wedge. And one of the things we're really interested in is whether or not those can reform if they have melted out in areas that have a lot of water or not, or once they've melted out, if they're just gone for at least the foreseeable future, and a little bit more of a permanent change. So I find that just such a fun question, and it's hard to think about the amount of time that it takes for water to build up into a big wedge like the one that I showed. We've seen ones that are a lot smaller than that so far, but I like that picture from the USGS because it's just such a cool looking one.
Yeah, that's an impressive amount of ice. I think of that scene in Frozen where they're sawing those big chunks of ice at the beginning. That's the first thing that popped to mind. So we're getting so many questions, and this is amazing. I'm trying to say somewhat in the same theme here. And then I know we have a lot of questions about what it's like to live and work at Toolik. So I promise I'm going to get to those. So you talk a little bit about microbes living in the area. And are there, obviously we just came out of, or we're still in a pandemic. Are there health concerns as well that people are studying about what's coming out of this permafrost as it thaws?
Yeah, so our group isn't focused on the microbial side of things. There's other folks who are working on that part. We're more on the water side of things. But there are groups who are paying attention to that. And my understanding is that there are some areas where that's more of a concern than others. And it's not something that's such a big deal in the area that we're working. But the microbes that are doing their things, they, in terms of, not making us sick, but in terms of chewing on the organic material and all the leaf litter, those are definitely active in our area. And some previous work by some colleagues suggests that maybe the gases that are released in some of the specific wet areas that we're working at, or even 20 times bigger than some of the permafrost that's right next door to it, which is wild. So the average is about 3 times, but right around this area, I don't know what the microbes are doing, but the gases can be even 20 times higher on average here, which is wild.
That is crazy. So want to back up to a pretty straightforward question, because I don't think you said this. What's the temperature where you are? And I know it's raining, I believe, or it's been raining on and off. When I talked to you last week, it had been snowing. So what temperatures are you working in? I mean, it's the summer there.
Yeah, totally. So I will say right now, I think you could see earlier it's raining, and you can definitely see in the background of Sarah's as seen by the beanie and the jacket. It's, I would say, like 40 degrees right now, Sarah, something like that. However, the first day I got here last week, that night it started snowing, which was kind of crazy to see. Being from North Carolina, you don't normally see snow in the winter, so that was definitely a big welcome to the Arctic. But it can also get as warm as 70 degrees in the summer as well. As you can see, mosquitoes really love when it's warm outside, and so we have to wear special bug shirts to sort of protect us from those mosquitoes. So packing to come to Tulik to do field work, I was told to prepare for anything from basically 20 degrees all the way up to 70 degrees. So you can really expect a wide range of temperatures here.
Wow, absolutely.
And then I think we had I think we just had a recent, question. The most recent question is how hot and how cold does it get here in the winter? And I'll just follow this up since it's on this kind of same realm. But yeah, during the summer, it gets anywhere from like 20 to, it can get slightly warmer than 70 degrees, but I think average is like roughly 70 degrees during the summer. But I know, Sarah Godsey, you've said you've been up here when it's been like 85, 90 at points. But then during the winter, it gets, it can get as cold as negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit here. And I don't know, I have not spent a winter here before. Maybe Haley can better answer a question of what it's like to work when it's that cold. But during the winter, it's typically below 0 degrees Fahrenheit most of the winter.
Yeah, I think one of the lowest temperatures we've ever reached has been -60 degrees Celsius, I believe. So quite cold.
Bundle up. You need 15 layers of gloves and hats and everything to stay warm in that temperature. That is cold. I will pass on that. So we had some questions come in about the auto sampler, and you were showing us this tool. Can you differentiate snow melt versus permafrost melt? And maybe this person's asking about using the auto sampler, but maybe you have a different tool that helps you differentiate those types of differences. And then similarly, how old can you age the water that you're measuring?
Yeah, so the water that we're collecting is what we would call an integrated sample. So it's like the best way I could describe it is like if I fill this bottle, let's say I fill this bottle up from 5 different sources, and then I take a sample of it, but all those sources have mixed. So we can't really differentiate whether the water is coming from purely permafrost thaw or purely snow melt or purely rain. And in accompanying that, we're not really dating the water in a sense. What we're doing is I filter the water back in our lab in Idaho once it's been collected and shipped back to Idaho. And then what we do something called stable isotopes. We're studying stable isotopes. So that mainly deuterium, which is hydrogen, and then oxygen. And then I can use mainly what I'm using is the oxygen values to do something called fraction Young water, which, to put very simplistically, is just the amount of water in the stream that is younger than roughly 2 months of age. But it doesn't really give us an age. Like I can't say that the water is, 50 days or 3 months old. But what I can state is like 15% of the water in the stream is younger than 2 months, if that makes sense. So we're not doing any actual age dating, which is possible just in other areas and possibly here, but just not with the methods that we're employing.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So Sarah, in your slides, you showed us some pictures of what happens when some of that permafrost melts. And so kind of combining a few questions is, have you ever lost any of your tools due to the permafrost melt? Kind of a great example of what you have going on. And are there efforts that you maybe could speak to about how communities are addressing these types of permafrost issues? For example, we can now build hurricane, grave buildings or earthquakes. Is this something that's going on in these areas where permafrost melt is becoming an increasing issue?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So let's see. I'm going to start out with, have we seen the permafrost thaw like right at where our sites are? And I would say the answer to that is yes. We haven't lost any equipment due to it yet. And I'm going to keep my fingers crossed on that. But we definitely have seen the permafrost is thawing and a bunch of the material is actually moving downstream. So I think that there was a question about organic material and whether organic material is being measured. We're going to start those measurements this summer at our sites, and I will be really surprised if we don't see pretty high levels of organic material, but also some sediment from the mineral soil horizon is also getting moved. And so I think we're going to see a lot of that, but stay tuned. And then in terms of permafrost thaw and kind of what people do about it, if you this probably wasn't super obvious from the tour when Brandon and Noah went outside really briefly, but you might have noticed that one of the a lot of the buildings around here are actually not sitting on the ground. They're up on stilts of some sort. And so that's partly to be able to accommodate changes in the ground surface if they're happening. And a lot of times the construction crew is really careful to make sure that they drain the area right around where they're going to put a building and put gravel and other materials that drain really well from around the building so that they are less likely to be moving up and down too much. But last year, one of my buildings was actually creaking a lot when people were walking through it, and you could sort of feel it a little bit. And the crew came through and just adjusted the legs on the building a little bit so that it didn't move quite so much. And then there's another thing, if you're that I just want to emphasize. We've used the words thaw and melt, and you might think about this like if you pull, if you pull a pork chop out of your freezer and let it thaw for making dinner, you're not expecting it to melt completely, right? Like if you said my pork chop melted, that would sound really gross. And so permafrost soil, when it's got a lot of soil in it, is actually going to thaw because it's mostly solid, kind of like that pork chop. And then the liquid that's in it might melt. So if there's a big ice wedge, like I showed, that might melt out. But the permafrost soil itself is likely to thaw. And so a lot of permafrost scientists are really careful about that language. So for those of you who are learning about this, maybe that's one thing you can take away, is that there's a difference between permafrost thaw and permafrost melt.
Oh, that is a fantastic clarification. Thank you so much for that, to update my knowledge and my language here. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit since I looked at the time, because I want to get to what your life is like. So I'm going to start with everyone's favorite question: animals. What kind of animals do you see at Toolik or at your field site? Someone asked about polar bears. And I do want to say there is a fantastic Toolik naturalist journal that everybody will get in an email after the event. And they post amazing photos of animals that they see around Toolik. But I want to give that to you to answer.
Yeah, sorry about that. We've seen a little bit of wildlife at our field sites. So our field sites are somewhat close to the road. So we don't typically see a ton of wildlife, just given the fact that there are proximity to the road. But we've mainly seen caribou. We've seen the construction crew has seen a moose at our northernmost site. And outside of that, We've seen a fox on the way to one of our sites. We actually saw a fox yesterday on the way to one of our sites. But overall, like actually near our sites, there's not too much, just given our proximity to the road. But there are a lot of things to see up here at Tulik. There's a lot of birds. I won't pretend to know much about birds and what type of birds are around us. But if you are a big bird person, this is a wonderful place to be because there's a lot of birds you may not be able to find anywhere else in the world. You saw a porcupine this weekend.
Yeah, totally. I think there was a question about like what we like to do for fun. And on the weekends, it's sort of a tradition on Sundays for groups to go out and go on hikes. And I went on my first sort of Arctic hike this past weekend. And right off the bat, as soon as we started our hike, I saw a porcupine crossing a stream. And I had like never seen a porcupine out in the wild. And it was much bigger than I thought and moving incredibly slowly. So that was something I did not expect to see.
Yeah. And we can also see muskox. I think our group saw a wolverine and a grizzly bear a couple days ago. I have not seen a bear up here, even though I spent 100 days up here last season and I never saw a bear. I was pretty bummed about that. Polar bears here, specifically answering the polar bear question, have been seen, but are pretty rare this far south. I know if I ever personally saw a polar bear, I would just call it for that day. That's the end of my work day. I'm not messing with polar bears. They're pretty dangerous relative to like a grizzly bear or a brown bear. So, but I have not personally seen a bear up here. Again, I think I attribute that mostly just to working close to the road. And then I will continue. There is another question that I would like to answer, if that's okay, Sarah.
Absolutely. Go for it.
Yeah, there was a question I asked by an 8-year-old is, since the sun does not set for a couple months, do you do anything fun at weird times like 3 a.m.? I will say I personally don't, because I'm old and I'm in bed and asleep by then. But other people do. We have a bonfire at Tulik every Saturday night, which usually lasts pretty late. And night may be a strong word, but we have a really large bonfire late into the night, even though it's sunny, like it would be noon outside. And people will go into the lake late at night. When the lake is thawed, some people will go on canoe rides in the lake really late at night. Right now, the lake is mostly frozen, so you can't really do that. But yeah, we do a lot of fun things. Most of the fun activities are on Sundays, because most people up here work Monday through Saturday. But we'll go on hikes on Sundays. There's a lot of events during the season, like there's trivia, there's a trivia event 3 times a season usually. One of my favorite events last summer was mini golf. So all of the labs in camp decorated their labs and turned them into mini golf courses. And we went around and played mini golf. Our lab, or at least my group, somehow won last year. But I think that was mainly because we were the only ones to turn in a completed sheet. So we won. But yeah, we also have every July 4th is like skits. So after dinner, you go and you get to make a skit, and you have like 2 hours basically to put a skit together between right after dinner and then when they happen. And then they're judged by the kitchen staff, of whoever gets the best skit gets some prizes. So there's a lot of events in camp. Like I said, the weekly bonfires, trivia nights, the mini golf last year. There was a couple of like skits, and there were a couple other ones I know I'm forgetting. So, but yeah, there's a lot of fun social events at Tulik. It's a very social place in that regard.
That sounds like fun. I want to come, just not when it's that cold. So I have time for, I think, about 2 questions. And I think that these ones are super interesting. I'm going to go a little bit backtrack to some animals. What would you say are some of the interesting adaptations of life in the Arctic? Obviously, you are studying the ground. You see probably some really cool plants, but even animals that you see or know of.
Yeah, I think that one of my favorite things, and maybe Haley, you can jump in with others that you've seen, is there's a team that's been up here studying ground squirrels that can actually handle really cold temperatures and have in their blood to be able to go much colder than any humans would be able to stand is really impressive to me. So that's one of the cool things that I've seen. And also the fact that, as soon as it warms up here, everything's going to turn on and be green like that. It's just going to be so fast. And then one of the coolest things for somebody who's studying the water side of things is that I've learned that there are plants that are really good at photosynthesizing and starting to eat even when they're buried under as much as almost a foot of snow. There's just enough light that gets through that they can start to photosynthesize under the snowpack. And so they take advantage of all the light they can get. And so try to extend their season just a little bit in case the snowpack is really thin. So those are some adaptations that I think are really neat.
Those are really cool. And I know we have some animals that change colors in summer or change their coloration, like a chameleon, in the winter and the summer. So those are some really cool adaptations that you're seeing in the Arctic. So I do want to end, and then I'm going to just share some resources with everybody who tuned in. What would you say is your one thing that you want everyone who joined us today to take away with them? Maybe it's a question we didn't get answered or something that didn't quite come up. What's the one takeaway you want to leave everybody with?
We're not all jumping in. I was going to let these guys go first. Do you want to jump in or do you want me to answer?
Oh, sorry, I was answering a different question. One thing to take away. Ooh. The Arctic field work can be difficult, but is very rewarding. We get to see lots of cool things. We get to spend time in a really cool place. And that the small streams that we're studying, these what we call water tracks and thermo-erosional gullies, are super important to the ecosystem up here, and are maybe not as well understood as we initially expected.
Yeah, for sure. I can sort of talk about mine. So I'm definitely sort of new to this project and sort of learning as I go. But what I've found is that I'm incredibly interested in just understanding more about how the Earth actually works and how global warming is having, sort of direct impacts on the planet. And for me, what has been so interesting about this project is being able to actually put my hands on what we're seeing. And that has helped me understand so much more about sort of our impact on the planet. And I would definitely encourage, if this totally sounds interesting to you, being able to have those types of hands-on learning experiences are absolutely amazing, and you get to sort of see some places that you might not get to see otherwise. So that would sort of be, I guess, my takeaway from this project.
Yeah, I love that, guys. Thanks. I think mine is maybe a little bit of a mixture of those two things. I don't know if any of you guys hear about global warming or hear about climate change and wonder if there's anything that you can do. And especially if you happen to either playing outside or doing math or working with your hands and problem solving and solving puzzles, then, think about being an Arctic scientist. It's really pretty fun stuff. So that would be my takeaway, I guess.
Awesome. A generation of new Arctic scientists. I love it. So as we finish up, I do just want to share some resources, and these are all going to come via email as well. So we have the NSF website as well as a bunch of educational resources that are available to everybody. We have the Toolik Field Station and the project website, H2 Cold. Great name there. They have a lot of really awesome things on their website. Highly recommend it. And then, of course, we have social media, NSF and Toolik. You can follow both of us. We encourage it. Great place to ask questions and learn more from the scientists. And so with that, I'm going to ask that Asa just keep the webinar open for a minute or two so that people, if they want to jot anything down, they can now. But again, you'll get it via email, and just extend my Sincere gratitude to Sarah and Noah and Brandon and Haley for joining us. I know you have a busy day of science coming up, so stay warm and we will see you soon.